never thought my own family could betray me in the smallest, cruelest way. When my scholarship trophy shattered under her hands, my stepmother called it an accident. But the security footage told a story she couldn't lie about. What happened next changed everything I believed about trust, justice, and family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Hannah Lawson, and I had just turned 17 when my world started unraveling in a way I never could have imagined. I had grown up in a quiet suburb of Cedarville, a town that looked picturesque in postcards but hid its undercurrents of tension in plain sight. My life had always been relatively stable, at least on the surface. My father, Richard Lawson, was a busy but loving man who worked long hours at a local law firm, and my mother had passed away when I was just a child, leaving a void I thought we'd all learn to navigate. After a few years, Dad remarried, a woman named Vivian Reed who had her own daughter, Clara, from a previous marriage. Vivian seemed polite and accommodating at first, always smiling and taking care to present herself as the perfect new stepmother, someone who could fill the empty spaces left behind. But in hindsight, I should have seen the warning signs much earlier. Growing up, I had always been ambitious. School was my sanctuary, the place where I could prove to myself that talent, effort, and determination could carve a path to the future I wanted. I excelled in everything I touched: science fairs, essay competitions, and particularly in my writing and research projects. By junior year, I had been awarded a prestigious scholarship for my academic achievements, a scholarship that would cover my college tuition almost entirely. The moment I held that shiny, gold-engraved trophy in my hands, I felt a swell of pride and hope. It wasn't just a symbol of success, it was the culmination of countless sleepless nights, late afternoons spent in the library, and endless papers rewritten until they were perfect. Our house, despite its spacious interior and neatly landscaped lawn, was never completely peaceful. Vivian often had a sharp edge to her words, subtle digs that would leave me questioning whether I was imagining the tension or if it was truly there. Clara, her daughter, was older and more aloof, often retreating to her room or spending hours out with friends. It wasn't unusual for me to feel like an outsider in my own home, a silent observer trying not to rock the boat. I had learned to navigate around Vivian's moods, keeping my head down and my achievements understated, thinking that if I stayed quiet, everything would stay calm. That balance, however, began to tilt one chilly November evening. I had just come home from school, trophy in hand, eager to place it on the shelf in my bedroom before heading out to my weekly debate club. I caught Vivian's gaze as she sang so too. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and the kind of baked goods Vivian favored. But something felt off as soon as I stepped through the door. The living room wasn't its usual order, but the faint sound of laughter, or maybe a smirk in her voice, caught me before I even saw her. "Hannah, you're home early," Vivian said, her tone light but oddly clipped. I nodded, smiling, and walked past her toward the stairs, the trophy carefully clutched against my chest. I remember the moment vividly. As I reached the top step, Vivian appeared behind me, asking casually if I'd mind putting the trophy down for a moment. "Just on the table," she said with a gentle smile, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that I didn't catch at first. I hesitated, and before I could respond, the trophy slipped from my hands, not because I dropped it, but because she had nudged it just slightly. The crash was immediate and terrifying. The metal bent, the plaque cracked, and shards of the plastic base skittered across the floor. My heart froze as I stared at what had once represented years of hard work, now lying in ruins. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, though the words felt hollow, rehearsed. "It was an accident, Hannah, really." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to swallow the disappointment and anger, to trust that she hadn't meant to harm me. But as I knelt to inspect the pieces, I felt a strange, prickling sense of unease. Something about the way she avoided my gaze, the subtle curl of her lips, didn't add up.
I had always been meticulous about my achievements, and the trophy was more than just an object. It was proof that I had earned my place in the world through my own effort. To have it broken and to have the explanation brushed off as an accident felt deeply wrong. I tried to hold back my tears, thinking that confronting her here and now would only escalate the tension in our already fragile home.
Over the next few days, the weight of that moment lingered. I avoided going into the living room where the broken pieces still sat on the coffee table, and I started noticing other small things. How Vivian's eyes darted away when I entered a room. How Clara would smirk whenever she saw me frowning at something that had been tampered with or misplaced. The feeling of being constantly on edge was new to me, yet familiar in a way that made my stomach knot. I didn't yet know that the security camera in the hallway, a forgotten feature of our smart home system, had captured the entire incident. I didn't know that this footage would soon become the key to proving what really happened that evening. School carried on as normal, but my mind was elsewhere. Teachers praised my continued dedication, classmates admired my resilience, and I kept pushing myself, believing that nothing, not even the chaos at home, could derail my progress. Yet every night when I returned to that house, I felt the shadow of betrayal lingering in the corners, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. I was beginning to realize that the so-called accident might not have been accidental at all. Somewhere deep down, I knew that confronting it would require courage, strategy, and the kind of meticulous proof that could leave no room for doubt. I just didn't yet know that the camera had been silently recording everything, quietly waiting to deliver the truth I couldn't see. And so, that evening marked the beginning of a journey I could never have anticipated. A journey where trust, deception, and justice would collide in ways that would redefine my understanding of family, loyalty, and standing up for what was right. That night, with the shards of my scholarship trophy at my feet, I took the first trembling step into a story that would change my life forever. The days following the trophy incident felt like walking on a tightrope suspended over a storm. At school, I maintained my usual composure, smiling at friends and answering teachers' questions with confidence. But at home, everything felt fractured. My father remained blissfully unaware of the subtle tensions escalating beneath his roof, still immersed in his demanding work schedule, while Vivian continued to maintain her veneer of normalcy, laughing a little too brightly at dinner conversations, insisting that the accident had been entirely unintentional. Clara, meanwhile, seemed to take a quiet pleasure in my growing unease, her smug glances and whispered comments to her friends echoing through the hallways like tiny daggers. It was in these moments that I began to understand how complicated family dynamics could be when loyalty was fractured and intentions were concealed. I realized that my home, once a safe place where I could retreat from the pressures of school, had become an arena of subtle hostility, where even my smallest achievements were scrutinized or undermined. I spent hours replaying the trophy incident in my mind, trying to reconcile the polite explanation with the nagging feeling that something was off. The trophy had represented years of effort, and the thought that someone would deliberately break it only to mask it as an accident was almost too heavy to bear. I found myself constantly scanning the rooms, noticing things I had overlooked before. Small scratches on furniture, displaced objects, and the faint scent of perfume lingering in spaces where it didn't belong. I began to question the motives behind everyday interactions. Vivian's casual remarks, Clara's seemingly innocent teasing, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that my instincts hadn't been wrong. Something was very wrong in our house. Something carefully hidden behind smiles and polite reassurances. It was during one of these tense evenings that I discovered the hallway security camera. It was a small, almost inconspicuous device,
mounted near the ceiling, angled in a way that covered the main entrance and the living room where the trophy had been broken. I had no idea how long it had been there. It was the kind of thing that homeowners might forget about, a subtle feature of a smart home system meant to offer peace of mind. My curiosity, fueled by a mixture of suspicion and desperation, led me to ask my father about it. He brushed it off at first, claiming it was merely a leftover from a security upgrade years ago, something he hadn't even noticed in ages. I nodded, pretending to accept his answer, but inside I knew that this camera might hold the key to understanding exactly what happened the night my trophy was destroyed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The following weekend, I waited until the house was quiet and Dad was out running errands before I ventured into the hallway to inspect the camera more closely. With trembling hands, I managed to access the live feed through the app on my phone, my heart thudding in anticipation. What I saw made my stomach twist. There, in the dim glow of the living room lights, was the unmistakable moment the trophy was broken. Vivian reached out with a subtle motion, brushing against the base of the trophy just enough to send it crashing to the floor. Clara was nearby, laughing softly as if in complicity, and the casual expressions on their faces belied the destruction they had just caused. My chest tightened, my mind racing with disbelief and anger. It wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't yet name: betrayal, hurt, and a growing resolve to confront the truth. I knew that simply showing Dad or demanding an apology wouldn't be enough. Vivian was skilled at charm and manipulation, and her version of events would almost certainly make me appear overreacting or overly sensitive. This realization forced me to begin thinking strategically. I needed evidence, a timeline, and an undeniable record of what had occurred, and the security footage gave me exactly that. The first step was documenting everything carefully. I downloaded the video, made multiple backups, and stored them securely on a USB drive I could hide in my bedroom. Each time I replayed the clip, I felt my anger solidify into determination. This wasn't just about a trophy anymore. It was about respect, fairness, and asserting that my hard work deserved recognition, not sabotage. As I began to process the situation, I noticed patterns I had missed before. Vivian's interference was not limited to the trophy incident. School papers I had left on the dining table were mysteriously misplaced, gifts I had received from teachers were missing from my room, and casual remarks from Clara seemed designed to belittle my accomplishments. Each of these small actions, previously easy to dismiss, now formed a web of subtle undermining. It became clear that the trophy incident was the most visible expression of a deeper problem, a persistent effort to diminish my achievements and destabilize my confidence. I began to understand that exposing this behavior would require careful navigation. Impulsive reactions could backfire, painting me as combative or ungrateful. Despite the tension at home, I continued to excel academically. Each success became more meaningful, a personal reminder that my worth wasn't defined by the opinions or manipulations of those around me. Teachers noticed my continued dedication, often offering words of encouragement that bolstered my resolve. Friends remained supportive, though unaware of the full depth of my domestic struggles. Their belief in me contrasted sharply with the quiet hostility at home, reminding me of the stark divide between my private and public lives. This duality weighed heavily on me, reinforcing my sense of isolation, yet also strengthening my resolve to see the situation through. By the end of the week, I had a plan forming in my mind. The footage gave me undeniable proof of the incident, and I knew it could be used strategically to confront Vivian and eventually involve my father in a way that left no room for doubt. But I also recognized the emotional stakes. Bringing the truth to light could spark conflict, retaliation, and upheaval in our household.
Still, the growing sense of injustice and the need to reclaim what was rightfully mine made the risk feel necessary. I realized that navigating the situation would require patience, careful observation, and the courage to act when the moment was right. The trophy, broken though it was, had become a symbol of more than academic achievement. It represented my right to stand up for myself, to demand honesty and respect in a household that had slowly eroded both. And so, with the footage safely stored and a plan beginning to take shape, I prepared myself for the battles ahead. I knew the coming weeks would test my patience, intelligence, and resilience. Yet deep down, I also felt a flicker of hope. The truth had a way of revealing itself, and with the evidence in my hands, I finally had a chance to ensure it did. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day that started ordinary and mundane, but ended with everything inside me shifting. I had returned from school, clutching my backpack and the stack of graded essays I had worked on tirelessly, expecting the usual quiet tension in the house. My father had been called into a late meeting, and Clara had disappeared to meet friends, leaving only Vivian and me in the living room. I placed my essays on the coffee table, careful to keep my hands away from the jagged remains of the shattered trophy, still tucked in its corner like a grim reminder of what had happened. Vivian was perched on the sofa, scrolling on her phone, her posture casual, almost careless. I tried to ignore her, focusing on the work in front of me, but the nagging sense of unease was impossible to shake. Something in the way she glanced up at me, the faint curl of her lips, felt deliberate. I realized with a sinking heart that the tension in our household had reached a tipping point.
I was halfway through reading an essay when I heard a crash from the kitchen. My heart leapt and I rushed toward the sound, finding the room in disarray. Dishes had been knocked to the floor, a glass shattered, and a faint trail of water was spreading across the tiles. Vivian stood frozen, feigning surprise, while her eyes flickered toward me. "Oh, I didn't mean to. Just an accident," she said, her voice clipped, almost rehearsed. Something inside me snapped. I was tired of the endless excuses, the constant minimization of her actions, the way she brushed off responsibility as if my feelings didn't matter. I realized that the broken trophy, the small sabotages, the subtle manipulations, they were all part of a pattern that could no longer be ignored. I felt an intense mixture of anger and determination. I asked her to step aside, my voice steady but firm, insisting that she clean up the mess and leave me out of it. She complied reluctantly, muttering under her breath, but the sense of control that I felt was fleeting. The incident made me realize that the accident with the trophy was not a one-time mistake. It was the first visible sign of repeated intentional undermining. Every misplaced paper, every mocking remark, every subtle dig had led to this moment where I could no longer deny the truth. I had reached a point where pretending everything was fine was no longer sustainable. The situation had escalated to the point where ignoring it could no longer protect my emotional well-being or my sense of self-worth. That evening, after Vivian had retreated to her bedroom, I sat alone in my room reviewing the security footage again. My heart pounded as I watched the scene unfold in slow motion. The deliberate motion of her hand against the trophy, the quick smirk she exchanged with Clara, and the calm pretense that followed. It was undeniable. The footage left no room for interpretation or denial. I realized that the stakes had changed. This was no longer about a broken object. It was about the truth of my experience being recognized, the acknowledgement of the patterns of manipulation, and my right to confront them without fear of being dismissed. I started planning carefully. I couldn't confront Vivian in the heat of the moment. That would only lead to arguments and more lies. I needed an approach that would allow the truth to be undeniable, supported by evidence, and presented in a way that could not be twisted. I also realized I needed to prepare my father, but cautiously. He had always trusted Vivian, assuming her good intentions, and I knew that a direct accusation without proof could create disbelief or defensiveness. I decided that the footage would be the central piece of my strategy, a concrete, irrefutable account of what had happened. My next steps required patience, precision, and courage, and I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me.
School provided a temporary refuge from the turmoil at home, but even there, I was aware of the growing internal tension. Every achievement, every positive comment from teachers felt tinged with the knowledge that my accomplishments at home were being undermined. Yet, I refused to let the situation define me. I threw myself into my studies with renewed determination, channeling my frustration into my writing and research. The scholarship had always been a symbol of my dedication, but now it represented something even larger: the right to claim my voice, assert my integrity, and demand recognition for what I had earned. I realized that the upcoming weeks would require both mental fortitude and careful observation, watching for any signs that Vivian or Clara might attempt to escalate their manipulations or attempt to discredit me. Then came the inciting incident that truly changed everything. One evening, my father called me into his office holding a letter from the scholarship committee. I expected congratulations or routine updates, but instead his face bore a strange mix of confusion and concern. "Hannah, have you seen this?" he asked, handing me the letter. My hands trembled slightly as I read it, realizing that the scholarship had been questioned due to missing or damaged documentation that had inexplicably been misplaced in the last week. The letter implied that the scholarship could be at risk if the matter wasn't clarified promptly. My stomach sank. The timing, the coincidence, it all pointed to deliberate interference. This was no longer just about proving what happened with the trophy. It was about protecting my future, my hard-earned opportunities, and the integrity of my achievements. I realized that the situation had become unsustainable. I could no longer ignore the pattern of sabotage, nor could I trust that the small apologies and reassurances would protect me from further harm. The scholarship, once a symbol of pride, had now become a potential casualty of the same hidden tensions that had haunted our household for months. I understood that immediate action was necessary, not impulsive retaliation, but careful, strategic steps that would expose the truth, protect my accomplishments, and finally make Vivian accountable for her actions.
That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a mixture of fear and determination coursing through me. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, that confronting the hidden manipulations in my family would be emotionally charged and potentially isolating. Yet I also knew that for the first time, I had clarity. The inciting incident had forced me to acknowledge that the old way, pretending, minimizing, and hoping for understanding, was no longer viable. I had to act, and I had to do it with precision, patience, and undeniable evidence. The shattered trophy, the footage, and the pattern of sabotage had all led to this moment, the breaking point where I could no longer remain silent. The next morning, I woke with a sense of urgency unlike anything I had ever experienced. The scholarship letter still weighed heavily in my mind, and the footage I had captured seemed almost alive in my memory, replaying the deliberate motion of Vivian's hand, the subtle smirk, the quiet complicity of Clara. I knew I couldn't confront Vivian alone, not yet. I needed an outside perspective, someone impartial who could recognize the truth without bias. That was when I decided to enlist the help of Miss Evelyn Parker, my guidance counselor at Cedarville High. She had always been approachable and fair, a person whose judgment I trusted implicitly. More importantly, she had experience navigating conflicts at home and school, and could help me understand how to handle the situation strategically. I scheduled an appointment to meet with Miss Parker after first period. My hands shook slightly as I held my phone, making sure the footage was safely backed up in multiple locations, ready to present if necessary. When I arrived in her office, she greeted me warmly. Her eyes immediately recognized that something serious was on my mind. I explained the situation carefully, starting with the broken trophy, the repeated sabotages, and the suspicious timing regarding the scholarship letter. I showed her the footage, holding my breath as the images appeared on her computer screen. Her expression shifted from concern to quiet acknowledgement as she watched the moments unfold, the deliberate act, the calculated timing, and the attempt to mask it all as an accident. "This is undeniable, Hannah," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "No one could interpret this as an accident. You have solid evidence, and you're handling this the right way by documenting everything and seeking guidance."
I felt a flicker of relief, a validation I hadn't realized I was craving so desperately. For weeks, I had felt like I was navigating a minefield alone, unsure of whether my instincts were accurate or if I was overreacting. Now, for the first time, an outside adult had seen what I had been experiencing and confirmed that my concerns were legitimate. Miss Parker advised me to prepare a clear, factual report of the events, emphasizing the importance of presenting objective evidence rather than accusations. She stressed that my goal was to protect my achievements and well-being, and that keeping my composure would strengthen my credibility when confronting my father or other authorities. Emboldened by her advice, I began creating a detailed timeline of events. I included dates, specific incidents, the scholarship letter, and, of course, the security footage. I annotated each event with precise observations, notes on Clara's subtle teasing, Vivian's manipulative remarks, and the repeated disruptions to my personal space. Compiling this information was exhausting, but also strangely empowering. I felt a growing sense of control over a situation that had previously made me feel powerless. By putting everything in writing, I was transforming the chaos into clarity, turning frustration into strategy. It was a tangible way to assert my narrative against the constant undermining that had defined life at home for months. As I worked, I noticed subtle changes in the household dynamics. Vivian had begun acting differently, almost as if she sensed the shift in my approach. She lingered longer in shared spaces, her smile a little too fixed, her questions a little too pointed. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to sense that I had found an ally in this Evelyn, glancing at me with curiosity and suspicion whenever I returned from meetings or whispered discussions. These small observations confirmed what I had suspected. My strategy needed to be careful, deliberate, and airtight. I couldn't leave anything to chance. Any misstep could give Vivian an opportunity to manipulate the narrative again. It was during this time that I decided to bring another trusted adult into the loop, Mr. Jason Reed, the principal of Cedarville High. While Miss Parker could guide me on counseling and documentation, Mr. Reed had the authority to intervene in matters that could affect my scholarship and academic standing. I requested a private meeting, and once again, I presented the timeline, the evidence, and the footage. His reaction mirrored Miss Parker's, initial surprise followed by clear acknowledgement of the severity of the situation. "Hannah, this is serious," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "You have documented everything meticulously, and the footage leaves no room for misinterpretation. I will support you in any steps needed to ensure your achievements are protected."
With both Ms. Parker and Mr. Reed on my side, I felt a surge of confidence. For the first time, the idea of confronting my father didn't feel overwhelming. I knew I had allies who could corroborate my account, guide the conversation, and ensure that my voice was heard without being dismissed. It became clear that the first plot point, the point of no return, was approaching. Once my father saw the evidence, there would be no going back to pretending that the broken trophy was merely an accident. The truth would be unavoidable, and the household dynamic would shift in ways that could no longer be contained. That evening, I prepared myself mentally for the conversation with my father. I rehearsed my points, reminding myself to stay calm, objective, and factual. I organized the files and video footage in a clear, concise manner, anticipating questions or attempts at denial. I knew that confronting Vivian without my father's awareness could provoke conflict and defensiveness. So my plan was to approach my father first, present the evidence calmly, and allow the objective truth to speak for itself. The strategy felt meticulous, almost clinical, but I understood that this was necessary to ensure the situation didn't spiral out of control. By the time Dad returned home, I had rehearsed my approach multiple times, my nerves giving way to a determined focus. I waited until dinner was cleared and the house quiet before requesting a private moment with him in his study. My hands were steady, my voice measured, and my heart raced with anticipation. I was about to cross a line that would change everything. The first step in revealing the truth in a way that couldn't be denied or ignored.
And as I handed him the USB drive containing the footage, along with my annotated timeline, I realized that this moment was more than a confrontation. It was the culmination of weeks of careful observation, strategic planning, and unwavering belief that the truth mattered above all else. The days after presenting the evidence to my father were a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief because at last, someone who had authority and care in my life had seen the truth. Tension because I now knew that Vivian would recognize that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. Dad was quiet for the first few hours after reviewing the footage. He paced around the study, muttering to himself as he replayed each moment on the screen. I could see his disbelief turning into anger, and then into resolve, but there was also the faintest hint of worry in his eyes. Worry about how Vivian would react, and how this confrontation might escalate in our home. I stayed silent, letting him process, knowing that my role now was to provide clarity and support, not to provoke further chaos. Over the next week, I noticed subtle but unmistakable changes in the household. Vivian's tone grew colder, her smiles less genuine, and she began monitoring my movements more closely. Clara, sensing the tension, became more overt in her mockery, making sarcastic comments whenever she could. It was clear that they recognized that the tide was turning, and they were preparing to defend their version of events. I had anticipated this, and that is why I continued meticulous documentation. Every interaction, every remark, every suspicious incident was logged in my journal with timestamps and observations. Even small things like Vivian adjusting a picture frame where my school certificates were displayed, or muttering under her breath when I entered the room, were carefully noted. Each note became another piece of the puzzle, evidence that the disruption at home was not an isolated incident, but a calculated pattern of manipulation. School provided a crucial reprieve. At Cedarville High, I focused on my assignments, debates, and extracurricular responsibilities with renewed intensity. Yet, even there, the rising opposition from home loomed in the back of my mind. My friends noticed that I was more vigilant, more alert to subtle cues, and they offered quiet support without needing to fully understand the complexity of my domestic struggles. Teachers remarked on my continued dedication, but I could sense that my motivation had transformed. It was no longer simply about grades or accolades. It was about asserting my autonomy, defending my achievements, and preparing to face the mounting opposition at home. The scholarship was technically secure, but the subtle interference I had documented suggested that Vivian and Clara might attempt to undermine it if given the chance. I knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed strategy, timing, and patience.
By midweek, Dad had begun confronting Vivian indirectly. He asked about her day, her involvement in household matters, and even casually questioned her about incidents involving the trophy, framing it as concern for the well-being of the family rather than a direct accusation. Vivian's responses were careful, measured, but they carried a tension that was impossible to hide. I realized that Dad's approach, though cautious, was beginning to unravel the narrative Vivian had carefully constructed over months. She was forced to provide explanations for her actions, and the security footage loomed silently over her every word, a concrete record that contradicted any attempt at fabrication. The first significant opposition came during a family dinner that week. Vivian's attempts to dominate conversation, subtly disparage my achievements, and steer the dialogue away from accountability were met with quiet, firm responses from my father. I could feel the tension building in the room as her smirk faltered, replaced by tight-lipped frustration. Clara, sensing the shift in power, became more openly antagonistic, interjecting sarcastic comments that sought to provoke reactions from me. I remained calm, knowing that any emotional outburst would play into their hands and allow them to claim victimhood. Instead, I documented everything mentally and in my notebook later, noting specific phrases, gestures, and timing.
Each observation became part of the rising evidence, the mounting pressure that was gradually cornering them. At school, I continued to prepare for the possibility of formal involvement from authorities or scholarship representatives. I reviewed the scholarship committee's guidelines, ensuring that I could provide documentation if necessary. I even began drafting a timeline of events that combined the trophy incident, the sabotages, and the scholarship letter interference, creating a comprehensive record that would leave no room for misinterpretation. My strategy was meticulous: anticipate counter-arguments, maintain composure, and present the truth in a way that was undeniable. It was both exhausting and empowering, reinforcing my belief that careful preparation and calm determination could overcome even the most entrenched manipulation. The week ended with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in household dynamics. Vivian's behavior grew increasingly cautious, as if she recognized that the rising opposition was no longer something she could control entirely. Clara's teasing became sharper, but it lacked the confidence it once carried, and even Dad seemed more alert and engaged, asking pointed questions and insisting on transparency in ways he hadn't before. The evidence I had compiled, combined with the external support from Miss Parker and Mr. Reed, was beginning to tilt the balance in my favor. I realized that the first pinch point, the gathering of evidence and the rising opposition, was reaching its peak. I felt a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration, knowing that the next steps would be critical, that the stakes had never been higher, and that every choice I made could influence the outcome. As I lay in bed that night, reviewing my notes and mentally replaying each interaction, I understood one undeniable truth. The path forward required courage, precision, and unwavering commitment to the truth. Vivian's mask was cracking, Clara's complicity was evident, and the evidence I had painstakingly gathered was ready to speak for itself. The rising opposition was real, but so was my determination to see justice for myself and my hard-earned accomplishments. The coming days would demand strategy, resilience, and focus. But for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. I was no longer a passive observer in my own life. I was actively shaping the path forward, and the truth was on my side. The following week brought the turning point I had both dreaded and anticipated, undeniable proof that could no longer be ignored. Up until now, I had carefully documented everything, relied on subtle observations, and compiled the security footage. But the reality of seeing the situation corroborated by someone with authority was an entirely different experience. It was during a scheduled meeting with my father and Miss Parker that the first concrete revelation took place, a moment that would irreversibly shift the household dynamic. I had prepared meticulously, ensuring that the footage was copied onto a high-resolution drive, backed up in multiple locations, and formatted in a way that left no room for distortion or misinterpretation. The sense of gravity in the room was palpable as we sat around the polished oak table in Dad's study, the early afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Miss Parker initiated the discussion with a calm, measured tone. She said, "Richard, Hannah has brought something important to our attention. We need to review the evidence together so that we understand exactly what has been happening." Dad nodded, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. I felt my pulse quicken as I handed him the USB drive, my fingers trembling ever so slightly despite my attempt to appear composed. The moment the first clip appeared on the monitor, the atmosphere shifted. Vivian, who had been quietly standing near the doorway, stiffened, her smile faltering. The footage showed her standing near my desk, casually nudging the base of the scholarship trophy. The slow-motion replay captured every subtle motion, the deliberate tilt of her hand, the precise moment the trophy toppled, and her immediate practiced attempt to mask it as an accident. Clara was visible in the background, stifling a laugh, her complicity undeniable.
Dad's eyes widened, his jaw tightening as he processed what he was seeing. I could feel the tension in the room like a physical weight pressing against my shoulders. Miss Parker remained composed, guiding the discussion with objective commentary. "This clearly demonstrates intent, Richard," she said. "This was not an accident. Hannah has documented this thoroughly, and the evidence is irrefutable." Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line and she averted her gaze, but there was no hiding from the visual proof displayed before us. Every frame of the footage contradicted her previous explanations, dismantling the carefully constructed narrative she had maintained for weeks. The clarity of the visual evidence was astonishing in its simplicity, leaving no room for alternative interpretations. For me, the feeling was surreal. Years of subtle manipulation, undermining, and frustration suddenly crystallized into something tangible, something undeniable. I realized that this moment marked the true midpoint of the story, the juncture at which the truth emerged in a way that could no longer be disputed. No excuses, no rationalizations, no rehearsed apologies could obscure the fact that the trophy had been broken intentionally. I could feel a rush of validation, a combination of relief and empowerment that coursed through my veins. All the planning, documenting, and strategizing had led to this point, and it felt like stepping onto solid ground after walking through a storm. Vivian, sensing the inevitability of exposure, finally spoke up, her voice tight and defensive. I didn't mean to. It was an accident," she stammered, her eyes flicking nervously between Dad, Miss Parker, and the footage. The words, though familiar, lacked any credibility in the face of the visual proof. I watched, heart pounding, as Dad's expression hardened, his disappointment and anger rising to the surface. "Vivian," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "the evidence is clear. This was not an accident. I need you to explain why this happened." The shift in authority was palpable. For the first time, the power dynamics in the household had tilted. Vivian's careful facade had been pierced, leaving her no option but to confront the undeniable truth. Clara, who had been quietly observing from the corner, finally spoke up as well. Her laughter, once a weapon to belittle my accomplishments, had vanished, replaced by a wary defensiveness. I didn't do anything," she insisted, though her presence in the footage made the claim unconvincing. The undeniable proof not only exposed Vivian's actions, but also revealed Clara's complicity. It was a revelation that altered the entire household's understanding of events. The invisible threads of deception, manipulation, and sabotage that had haunted me for months were now laid bare, and there was no room left for denial. In the aftermath of the revelation, Dad turned to me, his expression softening. "Hannah, I'm so sorry you've had to endure this. You've been meticulous in documenting everything, and you've handled this with incredible courage and composure." Hearing those words after months of uncertainty, fear, and emotional strain felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. For the first time, I felt truly validated. My instincts had been correct all along, and the truth had emerged in a way that could not be dismissed, twisted, or ignored. The moment was not just about exposing the broken trophy. It was about reclaiming my voice, asserting my worth, and standing firmly in the face of manipulation. That night, after Vivian had retreated to her room in silence and Clara had gone to bed, I sat in my bedroom reflecting on the day's events. The footage had achieved what months of observation, careful documentation, and strategic planning had been building toward: undeniable proof of intent. I felt a renewed sense of determination and clarity. The revelation marked a pivot in the story, a turning point where the momentum shifted irrevocably in my favor. From this point forward, the narrative could no longer be shaped by lies or deception. The next steps would involve confronting the full scope of the household's complicity, navigating the aftermath, and ensuring that the truth was not only recognized but acted upon. I realized that the major revelation, the midpoint, was more than just a moment of exposure. It was the moment when the hidden truth became undeniable, when the patterns of manipulation could no longer hide behind excuses, and when I could finally see the path forward. It was the moment where hope, validation, and courage converged, providing the momentum necessary to navigate the next phase of conflict. The evidence had spoken, and the silence of complicity had been shattered.
The journey to justice, vindication, and restored integrity was now fully underway. The revelation from the security footage had settled like a stone in my chest, heavy but grounding, and for the first time, I understood that I could no longer protect anyone else's image or pretend that the truth could remain hidden. Up until now, I had carefully documented, strategized, and sought guidance, but the time had come to act decisively. I realized that remaining silent or attempting to shield Vivian and Clara from consequences would only perpetuate the cycle of deception, manipulation, and subtle abuse I had endured for months. I had reached the point of no return, the moment where I had to make a choice: continue tolerating the false narrative or step forward, fully aware that exposing the truth would create tension, conflict, and confrontation in the household I had once considered safe.
I sat at my desk that evening, reviewing the footage one last time before preparing for the conversation I knew was inevitable. My father, already aware of the evidence, had left the decision to me on how and when to confront Vivian directly. It was a weighty responsibility, but one that I understood needed to be approached with care and precision. I knew that if I allowed anger or emotion to dictate my words, the confrontation could spiral into chaos, giving Vivian an opportunity to manipulate the story once again. Instead, I resolved to remain calm, objective, and unyielding, using the facts and evidence as my shield against denial and distraction. The trophy, the sabotages, and the scholarship interference were no longer abstract grievances. They were documented proof of intent, and that proof would guide the conversation. When the time came, I chose a moment when the house was quiet and my father was present. I asked Vivian to join us in the living room, keeping my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. Clara lingered nearby, her posture stiff, her eyes flicking nervously between us. I handed the USB drive to Dad, allowing him to place it in the computer and cue the footage. As the images played, Vivian's expressions shifted through a range of emotions: surprise, nervousness, and finally, the mask of casual denial she had relied on for weeks. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the knowledge that the evidence spoke louder than any words she could offer. I began to speak, my voice calm but firm, outlining the timeline of events, the patterns of interference, and the repeated attempts to undermine my achievements. "This isn't just about a trophy," I said, locking eyes with Vivian. "This is about a pattern of behavior that has affected my confidence, my sense of security, and even my scholarship. I cannot ignore it anymore, and I cannot allow this to continue." My words, delivered steadily and without accusation, carried the weight of months of observation and documentation. Vivian attempted to interject, her voice rising slightly, but I continued, calmly presenting each instance of manipulation with dates, descriptions, and references to the footage. Clara fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable, and even my father's eyes narrowed, a mixture of frustration and protective instinct evident as he listened to the details. Vivian's denial faltered as the footage replayed key moments: the deliberate motion toward the trophy, her smirk, and Clara's quiet laughter in the background. The visual evidence was undeniable, a silent witness that refused to be manipulated. I watched her reaction carefully, noting the slight tremor in her voice, the avoidance of eye contact, and the faltering rhythm of her excuses. It was clear that she realized the truth could no longer be hidden, that her careful facade was cracking under the weight of documented reality. My father, who had been quietly observing, finally interjected, his voice firm and measured. "Vivian, the evidence is clear. There is no room for interpretation. You need to acknowledge what has happened and take responsibility." That was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment when my choice to speak fully and fearlessly intersected with undeniable truth. I could feel a rush of both anxiety and empowerment as I continued to assert the facts, articulating the impact of the sabotage on my personal achievements and emotional well-being. For months, I had internalized the tension, doubted myself, and questioned whether I was overreacting. Now, as I spoke, I felt a profound sense of clarity. This was not about revenge, nor was it about creating conflict for its own sake. It was about reclaiming my voice, asserting my integrity, and ensuring that the truth was recognized without distortion. Vivian's response, when it finally came, was subdued, almost hollow.
I didn't realize, she began, but the words lacked conviction, and even she seemed to recognize their inadequacy in the face of the footage. Clara remained silent, her earlier attempts at mockery replaced by visible discomfort and a newfound awareness of the consequences her actions had wrought. The tension in the room was tangible, a mixture of acknowledgement, accountability, and the faint relief that comes from finally bringing hidden truths into the open. I realized that my decision to speak, to confront the deception fully, had shifted the entire dynamic of the household. After the conversation, my father pulled me aside, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Hannah, I am proud of you," he said quietly. "You handled this with courage, clarity, and integrity. You have spoken the truth, and it cannot be ignored or dismissed. I know this hasn't been easy, and it may take time for everyone to adjust, but you've done the right thing." His words were both comforting and validating, reinforcing the understanding that my choice to confront the hidden truth had been not only necessary, but transformative. In that moment, I realized that speaking out was not simply about exposing wrongdoing, it was about asserting my right to be seen, heard, and respected in a household where manipulation had once gone unchecked.
That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. From the broken trophy to the meticulous documentation, the support of trusted adults, and the strategic presentation of evidence, every step had been guided by a determination to uphold the truth. I knew the coming days would still present challenges, that the household dynamics might shift unpredictably, and that Vivian and Clara might attempt subtle retaliation. Yet I also understood that the act of speaking, of confronting deception with clarity and courage, had fundamentally changed the narrative. The secret that had haunted our home was now fully revealed, and the path forward, though uncertain, was illuminated by honesty and integrity. The days following my confrontation with Vivian were far from calm. If anything, the tension in our home escalated, as though the acknowledgement of truth had only intensified her determination to regain control. Vivian, once confident in her ability to manipulate perception, had become a careful, calculating presence, watching every movement, measuring every word. She no longer masked her hostility behind casual remarks or forced smiles. Instead, it simmered beneath the surface, a quiet threat that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Clara, who had previously flitted between mockery and indifference, began testing boundaries in small, deliberate ways, as if to probe whether the truth I had spoken would truly hold sway in the household dynamic. The living room, which had once felt familiar and neutral, now became a battlefield of subtle intimidation, silent stares, and loaded comments designed to destabilize me emotionally. I was acutely aware that the stakes had grown higher. The initial confrontation had revealed the truth to my father, but it had not yet fully neutralized Vivian's influence or Clara's complicity. I needed to maintain vigilance, documenting every action, every remark, and every attempt at manipulation. Each evening, I would sit in my room with my journal and replay the security footage in my mind, annotating not only the original incidents, but also the subsequent behaviors that seemed designed to undermine my confidence or reassert control. Vivian's increasingly pointed remarks about chores, responsibilities, or trivial mistakes were no longer casual. They were deliberate, a test to see if I could be provoked into emotional reactions that would weaken my credibility. Clara's smears, whispered comments, and subtle undermining were equally strategic, an attempt to preserve the power dynamics they had relied on for so long. The first major escalation occurred during a family gathering one Friday evening. We had invited my father's colleagues over for dinner, a seemingly normal event, but I sensed immediately that Vivian intended to use the occasion to reassert dominance, to subtly discredit me in front of outsiders. She engaged in forced politeness, laughter at inappropriate times, and repeated microaggressions aimed at highlighting minor flaws in my behavior. Clara, not missing the opportunity, joined in, interjecting sarcastic comments and rolling her eyes when I spoke. It was clear that they were attempting a coordinated effort to regain the upper hand. I recognized the pattern immediately and reminded myself to remain calm, measured, and focused on the facts I had documented. Any emotional response would give them the leverage they were seeking. After the guests departed, the confrontation escalated further.
Vivian approached me in the kitchen, her tone deceptively soft but laced with veiled threats. "You think you've won," she said, quietly, leaning close, "but you haven't seen the last of it. You're lucky your father hasn't completely lost patience." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I refused to respond with fear. Instead, I acknowledged her statement calmly, noting the intimidation tactic for my records, and excused myself to my room. It was a moment that crystallized the reality of mounting pressure. Exposing the truth had shifted the power, but it had also provoked retaliation. I understood then that I had entered a new phase where the conflict was no longer just about revealing past actions, but also navigating an environment in which Vivian and Clara actively sought to challenge my authority, credibility, and sense of stability. I turned to Miss Parker for advice on managing the rising pressure. In our next session, I explained the recent developments, the pointed remarks, the calculated provocations, and the underlying tension that permeated the house. She advised me to maintain a detailed log, remain calm, and continue documenting every interaction. "This is exactly why your meticulous preparation is invaluable," she said. "The truth alone isn't always enough. You must demonstrate consistency, composure, and resilience, especially when those around you attempt to discredit or intimidate you." Her words reinforced the importance of maintaining control in the face of mounting opposition. I realized that this phase of the conflict required not only evidence, but also emotional fortitude, strategy, and the ability to anticipate and respond to provocations without giving ground.
Over the following week, I noticed further attempts at intimidation. Vivian began rearranging items in shared spaces, subtly targeting areas where my achievements were displayed. My school papers, awards, and certificates were moved or obscured, small but deliberate acts designed to provoke doubt and frustration. Clara continued her verbal undermining, making cutting comments under the guise of joking, often in front of friends or family, to test my composure. I responded by documenting everything meticulously, maintaining calm, and focusing on my schoolwork and personal achievements as evidence of my resilience. I understood that the confrontation was no longer about a single incident. It had evolved into an ongoing struggle over perception, credibility, and control. The mounting pressure reached a peak when I received a call from the scholarship committee seeking clarification about the earlier concerns. My hands shook as I explained the situation, emphasizing the documented evidence and the corrective steps I had taken. The committee responded with reassurance, acknowledging my diligence and recognizing the validity of my documentation. The sense of relief was immense, but it also reinforced the necessity of continued vigilance. Vivian's attempts to manipulate perception at home could no longer affect the outcomes of my accomplishments, but the emotional toll was real and persistent. By the end of the week, it became clear that the confrontation with Vivian and Clara was not a single event, but an ongoing dynamic requiring strategic navigation. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences included heightened hostility, psychological pressure, and the need for careful, consistent reinforcement of boundaries. I realized that this second pinch point, the mounting pressure and direct confrontation with the antagonists, was testing my resilience, composure, and ability to maintain integrity under duress. Every interaction became a measure of my capacity to uphold the truth, assert my achievements, and withstand attempts at manipulation and intimidation. That night, as I reflected on the week, I recognized a profound internal shift. I had learned that truth alone could expose wrongdoing, but sustaining that truth required strategy, emotional control, and courage in the face of deliberate opposition. Vivian's mask had fallen, Clara's complicity was exposed, and yet their capacity for subtle intimidation remained. The challenge was no longer simply revealing the past. It was navigating a present in which the antagonists actively sought to destabilize me. And in that realization, I found both fear and empowerment. The stakes were higher than ever, but I also understood that I had the tools, preparation, and resolve to endure, persevere, and ultimately claim justice for myself. The following week plunged me into what felt like the darkest stretch of the entire ordeal. Though I had spoken the truth and secured undeniable proof, the consequences of that action hit harder than I had anticipated. Vivian,
who had previously relied on subtle intimidation and passive manipulation, escalated her tactics to active hostility. The atmosphere at home became stifling, thick with tension and unsaid threats. Every glance from her seemed calculated to provoke, every word carefully chosen to undermine my sense of confidence. Clara, emboldened by Vivian's anger, upped her taunting, whispering sarcastic comments under her breath whenever she could catch my attention. I found myself constantly walking on eggshells, wary of leaving any object in my room that could be moved or destroyed, cautious of every word I spoke, and hyper-aware of the potential for confrontation at any moment. The first major consequence manifested when my father, despite his belief in me, began questioning whether our home environment was becoming unmanageable. He noticed Vivian's escalating hostility, the palpable tension, and even Clara's increasingly aggressive comments. While he was sympathetic, his frustration added a new layer of emotional complexity. I could see his eyes clouded with worry, his voice tense when he reminded me to remain calm, and his attempts to mediate often felt like a delicate balancing act between supporting me and attempting to preserve some semblance of family cohesion. I understood that my decision to speak the truth had ignited a storm far larger than I had imagined. I wasn't simply confronting Vivian anymore. I was challenging the dynamics of an entire household, and the repercussions were immediate and intense. At school, the pressure followed me in subtler but equally intrusive ways. Although my teachers and counselors were supportive, my own anxiety grew. I found it difficult to focus on assignments or study sessions, my mind repeatedly circling back to the hostility awaiting me at home. Small successes felt overshadowed by the knowledge that upon returning, I would face Vivian's calculated provocations and Clara's taunts. Sleep became restless, and the weight of constant vigilance began to press on me physically as well as emotionally. Each evening, I returned home exhausted, not just from my academic responsibilities, but from the effort of maintaining composure under relentless pressure. The environment that had once been a source of stability now felt like a gauntlet, testing every ounce of resilience I had cultivated over the past months.
The breaking point came one evening when Vivian, having learned that I had presented the footage and documented incidents to my father and Miss Parker, confronted me directly in my room. Her voice was low and menacing, her expression cold, as she accused me of betrayal and exaggeration. "You think you can control the narrative?" she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "You've turned our home upside down, and for what, a stupid trophy?" The words stung, but it wasn't the insult that hurt, it was the isolation, the sense that the act of defending myself and speaking truth had inadvertently provoked deeper conflict. I realized that exposing hidden truths, while necessary, came with immediate emotional and relational backlash. Vivian's hostility was real, targeted, and exhausting, and it forced me to confront the harsh reality that truth alone did not immediately lead to peace or resolution. Clara, as expected, added her own layer of cruelty. She mocked my actions, imitating the way I had meticulously documented events and portraying it as obsessive behavior. The psychological assault was relentless, and for the first time I felt the sting of doubt creeping in. Was it worth it? Was my insistence on truth and accountability causing more harm than good? I felt the weight of isolation pressing on me, a suffocating reminder that the path of courage is rarely easy or unopposed. Even supportive voices from school or outside the home could not fully alleviate the exhaustion and anxiety of navigating a household where two people were actively trying to destabilize me emotionally. I retreated to my bedroom that night, seeking solace in the quiet hum of my desk lamp and the journal I had kept since the initial incidents began. I wrote down every encounter, every insult, every subtle intimidation, pouring out the frustration, anger, and exhaustion that had accumulated over weeks. The act of writing became both a coping mechanism and a strategy, a way to maintain clarity in the midst of emotional chaos. I realized that this was the dark night of the soul, the point where the consequences of speaking truth became most tangible, where the emotional toll peaked, and where I questioned the cost of courage. The exhaustion, the fear, and the frustration all coalesced into a profound awareness of vulnerability, highlighting just how isolating the pursuit of justice could be when those closest to you resisted accountability. Yet even in this lowest point, there was a faint glimmer of resolve. While the backlash was intense, it reaffirmed the significance of the choices I had made. The emotional and psychological toll was real, but so was the evidence I had gathered, the support I had from Miss Parker and the principal, and the growing recognition from my father that the truth could not be dismissed. I understood that this phase, as painful as it was
was a necessary crucible, an essential test of resilience before the final push toward resolution. The dark night of the soul is never comfortable, but it crystallizes the stakes, the courage required, and the necessity of persistence. I began to see the situation not as a series of isolated conflicts, but as a strategic progression toward justice, vindication, and the ultimate restoration of integrity in our household. By the end of the week, despite the mounting pressure, I felt a subtle shift within myself. I had weathered confrontation, hostility, and doubt, and although exhaustion lingered, so did determination. I knew the next phase would require careful, decisive action, the final push where truth would be tested publicly and formally. The emotional toll, the threats, and the backlash had sharpened my focus, solidified my strategy, and reinforced my commitment. Even in the depths of the dark night, I realized that speaking truth was not about avoiding pain, but about enduring it with courage in order to achieve lasting resolution. The day of the final push arrived with a sense of both anticipation and quiet dread. I had spent weeks preparing, documenting, and rehearsing the presentation of evidence, but now the moment to formally confront the situation loomed larger than any private confrontation at home. Dad had arranged a family meeting in the living room, inviting Miss Parker to mediate and clarify the situation, and insisting that Vivian and Clara be present to face the undeniable truth. The atmosphere was thick with tension as I arranged the USB drive, my meticulously annotated timeline, and copies of my journal notes. I felt a steady resolve build within me, a confidence rooted in months of preparation, observation, and careful strategizing. The confrontation I had long anticipated would not be casual. It would be a formal reckoning where truth, evidence, and composure had to align perfectly. Vivian entered the room with a forced air of composure, her expression a blend of irritation and feigned innocence. Clara followed, eyes darting between us nervously, unsure whether to display defiance or submission. My father sat at the head of the couch, calm but firm, signaling the seriousness of the discussion. Miss Parker stood near the side, a reassuring presence, ready to mediate and ensure the conversation remained focused and objective. I took a deep breath and began presenting my documentation, starting with the earliest incidents, the sabotages, and the scholarship letter interference. I outlined the deliberate nature of the acts, emphasizing the visual evidence captured on the security footage, and I guided the family through the timeline with clarity and precision, letting the facts speak for themselves.
As the footage played, the room was silent except for the clicking of the remote and the soft hum of the projector. Vivian's carefully crafted mask of nonchalance began to crumble. I could see the subtle changes in her expression, the slight twitch of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, the way her hands gripped the arms of the chair. Clara, once confident in her attempts at mockery, became increasingly tense, whispering to Vivian in low tones, seeking reassurance or perhaps a strategy to reclaim some control over the narrative. But the evidence was undeniable. Every motion, every deliberate act, and every subtle complicity was captured in high definition. It was no longer a private confrontation or a matter of perception. It was a visual, undeniable record of intent and manipulation. I paused periodically to provide context, explaining how each act had affected me emotionally, academically, and psychologically. I spoke about the countless nights of frustration, the anxiety of anticipating sabotage, and the constant vigilance required to protect my achievements and maintain my sense of self-worth. My voice was steady, measured, and free of malice. I understood that the strength of my argument came not from anger or retribution, but from clarity, evidence, and integrity. Vivian attempted to interject several times, her voice rising slightly, but I calmly acknowledged her comments and referred back to the documented evidence, allowing the facts to undermine her denials naturally. Each time, the visual proof silenced her attempts to manipulate the narrative, leaving her with fewer and fewer options to manipulate the narrative. By the time I reached the section of the timeline highlighting the scholarship letter interference, even Clara could no longer mask her discomfort. I carefully explained how the sequence of events had been meticulously tracked, showing timestamps and cross-referencing notes from both the footage and my personal observations. I emphasized that the pattern was deliberate, coordinated, and consistent, leaving no room for doubt or interpretation. The weight of the evidence was now unmistakable, and the realization seemed to settle over the room like a tangible presence. Vivian shifted in her seat uncomfortably, her earlier confidence replaced with defensiveness and tension.
The confrontation had moved beyond private disagreements or household power dynamics. It had become a formal presentation of truth, one that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. When I concluded, I allowed a moment of silence to let the information resonate. My father's expression was a mix of disappointment and relief, his voice calm but authoritative as he spoke. Vivian, Clara, the evidence is clear. This is not a matter of opinion or perspective, it is documented fact. Hannah has shown incredible diligence and courage in bringing this to light, and the behavior outlined cannot be overlooked. Miss Parker nodded in agreement, emphasizing the importance of accountability, reflection, and the immediate need for corrective action. The formal validation of my documentation and presentation solidified the reality that the truth had not only been revealed, but had also been publicly recognized by authority figures, leaving no room for denial or misinterpretation. Vivian finally spoke, her voice low and restrained. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she muttered, the carefully constructed defenses of previous weeks now replaced by reluctant acknowledgement. Clara remained quiet, her posture slumped, a clear sign of submission to the undeniable truth. I realized that this formal confrontation, the final push, was more than just about a broken trophy or sabotaged scholarship. It was a test of resilience, strategy, and composure, and it had succeeded in shifting the household dynamic, exposing the manipulations, and establishing a foundation for accountability. After the meeting, my father pulled me aside, his expression soft but filled with pride. "Hannah, you've handled this with integrity, courage, and clarity," he said quietly. "The truth has been presented, and it is undeniable. You've done more than defend yourself. You've set a precedent for honesty and accountability in this household." Hearing these words, I felt a sense of validation unlike anything I had experienced before. The final push had been demanding, emotionally exhausting, and high stakes, but it had succeeded. The truth was no longer hidden. It was formally recognized, validated, and respected. The days following the formal confrontation carried a weight of relief, tension, and a cautious sense of hope. For the first time in months, the dynamics at home had shifted, the truth had been exposed and formally recognized. And yet, change required more than acknowledgement. It demanded action, reflection, and accountability. My father took a firm stance in ensuring that Vivian and Clara understood the consequences of their actions, but he also encouraged measured responses, emphasizing the importance of repair and the establishment of healthier boundaries within our household. It became clear to me that the resolution of this conflict was not simply about the past. It was about creating a new equilibrium, a space where respect, honesty, and integrity could finally replace manipulation and deceit. Vivian, having faced undeniable evidence of her actions, gradually began to adjust her behavior. The defensiveness and passive aggressiveness that had dominated her interactions with me gave way to a more cautious, measured approach. While her attempts at manipulation did not vanish entirely, they became less frequent and less forceful, eroded by the combination of public acknowledgement and formal accountability. Clara, meanwhile, exhibited a growing awareness of the consequences of her complicity. Her teasing diminished, replaced by tentative interactions that suggested a recognition of the disruption her behavior had caused. The tension in our home, once almost tangible, began to ease slowly, creating space for dialogue, reflection, and even tentative rebuilding of trust.
The scholarship committee, upon reviewing my documentation and receiving confirmation from both Ms. Parker and my father, formally recognized the integrity and diligence I had demonstrated in handling the situation. I was reassured that my scholarship remained secure, and even more importantly, the validation from authority figures outside the household reinforced my confidence that standing up for the truth had been the correct course of action. I felt a renewed sense of empowerment, knowing that my achievements and voice were respected and protected, and that the meticulous documentation I had compiled had not only protected my interests, but also established a foundation for accountability within the household.
This period of resolution also allowed me to reflect on the personal growth I had experienced throughout the ordeal. The months of tension, manipulation, and emotional strain had tested my resilience, patience, and strategic thinking, but they had also revealed strengths I had not fully recognized in myself. I had learned to observe carefully, document meticulously, and approach conflict with both clarity and composure. I had discovered the importance of seeking guidance and support from trusted mentors and allies, and I had come to understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. These lessons, born from hardship, became a source of empowerment that extended far beyond the immediate conflict, shaping my approach to challenges in school, relationships, and personal growth. My father, recognizing the transformative nature of the experience, encouraged a family discussion about rebuilding trust and establishing clearer boundaries. The conversation was difficult, emotionally charged, and at times tense, but it allowed each of us to express perspectives, acknowledge wrongdoing, and commit to improved behavior moving forward. Vivian and Clara, though initially resistant, participated in the discussion with increasing willingness to listen and reflect. The acknowledgement of accountability, combined with the visible impact of their actions on our family dynamic, facilitated a shift toward mutual understanding and respect. It was not a perfect resolution, nor did it erase the past, but it represented a critical step toward equilibrium, where honesty and integrity were no longer optional but expected. I also found solace in reconnecting with my school community, sharing the experience with mentors who had guided me, and reflecting on the lessons learned. The act of documenting, exposing, and confronting the truth had required immense courage, and the formal acknowledgement of my efforts reinforced the value of diligence, resilience, and moral clarity. Teachers and advisors commended my composure, my meticulous attention to detail, and my ability to navigate a complex, high-stakes personal conflict with both maturity and strategic thinking. The validation was both empowering and affirming, reinforcing my belief that standing up for integrity is always worthwhile, even when the immediate consequences are emotionally taxing. As the household began to settle, I noticed subtle but significant changes in the environment. Conversations with Vivian, though still cautious, were more measured and less antagonistic. Clara's teasing diminished further, replaced by quieter interactions that suggested both recognition and tentative attempts at repair. My father, maintaining a balance between support and authority, reinforced positive behavior while ensuring that accountability remained central to the family dynamic. Even small changes, like the careful display of my academic achievements without interference, or the respectful tone in family discussions, became tangible indicators of progress. These incremental improvements, while seeming minor, signaled the establishment of a new equilibrium that honored honesty, respect, and shared responsibility. Reflecting on the journey from the initial trophy incident to this point, I realized that the resolution was not merely about vindication or justice, it was about transformation. The experience had reshaped our household dynamic, empowered me to assert my voice, and illuminated the importance of courage, documentation, and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. The validation from my father, Ms. Parker, and the scholarship committee underscored the broader lesson that truth, when approached with integrity and persistence, ultimately prevails. And while the journey had been fraught with tension, hostility, and emotional strain, it had also cultivated resilience, confidence, and a clearer understanding of the power of accountability in shaping both personal and familial relationships. By the end of the week, the household felt quieter, calmer, and more focused on constructive interaction. While vigilance remained necessary, the sense of constant threat and manipulation had diminished significantly. The acknowledgement of wrongdoing, the validation of my actions, and the careful rebuilding of boundaries established a new norm, one where truth was respected, accountability was expected, and personal integrity was both recognized and protected. I understood that the resolution of this chapter was not an endpoint, but a foundation, a base from which further growth, understanding, and mutual respect could flourish. The weeks that followed brought a profound sense of closure and a tangible transformation in both my household and within myself. The tension that had once dominated our home had finally eased, replaced by an environment where honesty, accountability, and mutual respect became the new standard. Vivian and Clara, having confronted the consequences of their actions, gradually adjusted to the reality that manipulation and sabotage would no longer yield power over me. Their attitudes softened, though not without effort, and small but meaningful gestures of acknowledgement and cooperation began to appear in everyday interactions. What had once been a household fraught with hostility and uncertainty now carried an undercurrent of order and fairness, a shift that I had long hoped for but never fully believed possible until it materialized through consistent effort and courage.
For me, the transformation went far beyond the immediate household dynamics. I realized that the months of tension, confrontation, and meticulous documentation had fundamentally reshaped how I approached challenges, conflict, and personal integrity. I had developed a capacity for patience, strategic thinking, and measured confrontation that I had never fully recognized before. Where I once might have reacted impulsively or internalized frustration, I had learned to observe, document, and respond with precision and clarity. This newfound strength extended to my academic life, social interactions, and extracurricular pursuits, giving me the confidence to navigate situations with a calm authority that was both empowering and deeply affirming. The experience had taught me that courage is cultivated through persistence and foresight, not just through bold gestures, and that integrity demands both vigilance and consistency. One of the most tangible signs of transformation came in how I approached my achievements. The scholarship trophy, once broken and a symbol of manipulation, was now carefully displayed in my room, unassailable and intact. It served not only as a reminder of the ordeal I had endured, but also as a symbol of perseverance, validation, and triumph over deceit. I had rebuilt my personal space to reflect the values I now prioritized: honesty, respect, and personal responsibility. Academic awards, letters of recognition, and certificates were prominently and safely displayed, a quiet declaration of my accomplishments and the integrity with which I had achieved them. The trophy was no longer a source of vulnerability. It had become a marker of strength, an emblem of resilience, and a reminder that truth, once established and defended, could not be undermined. My relationship with my father deepened during this period, strengthened by the shared journey of confronting wrongdoing and establishing accountability within the household. We spent evenings discussing strategies for managing conflict, reinforcing ethical behavior, and nurturing mutual respect among family members. His support had been a steadying force throughout the ordeal, and the acknowledgement of my diligence and courage reinforced a bond built on trust, understanding, and shared commitment to principles of fairness and integrity. The experience also highlighted the importance of external allies like Miss Parker, whose guidance and support had been instrumental in ensuring that the truth was recognized, documented, and acted upon. I came to understand that seeking help, when necessary, is not a sign of weakness, but a crucial step in achieving justice and maintaining balance in difficult circumstances. Vivian and Clara's eventual acknowledgement of their wrongdoing, while tentative at first, gradually solidified into a more consistent pattern of responsible behavior. Household interactions, once dominated by manipulation and subtle intimidation, became more transparent, respectful, and constructive. I realized that true transformation is rarely immediate or perfect. It requires persistence, guidance, and the conscious reinforcement of boundaries and expectations. The slow but steady improvement in their behavior demonstrated that change, when paired with accountability, is possible, and that even those who once sought to control and undermine can adjust when faced with undeniable truth and consistent consequences. On a personal level, the experience left an indelible mark on my character. I had learned the value of meticulous documentation, the importance of strategic thinking, and the power of presenting truth with clarity and composure. I had discovered that courage is not about seeking confrontation for its own sake,
but about taking principled action in the face of adversity. Most importantly, I understood that personal empowerment arises not solely from external validation, but from the consistent defense of one's integrity, even when challenged by those closest to us. The ordeal had transformed not only my household dynamic, but also my internal sense of self, instilling a confidence rooted in experience, resilience, and unwavering commitment to what is right. The initial image, both literal and symbolic, was the trophy itself, gleaming on the shelf, surrounded by awards, certificates, and tangible reminders of diligence, achievement, and perseverance. It represented not only academic success, but also moral victory, resilience, and the assertion of personal agency. I understood that this symbol encapsulated the full arc of my journey, from vulnerability to empowerment, from intimidation to integrity, and from manipulation to justice. And as I looked around my room, reflecting on the changes in my household, my relationships, and my sense of self, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, peace, and readiness for the future, knowing that the power of truth, once embraced and defended, could never be undermined.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.